In the present day, Olana State Historic Site stands intact yet unsettled. Its walls remain upright, its views uninterrupted, its name preserved on maps and plaques. And still, something essential has slipped away. The house survives. The system that once justified its existence does not. Olana was not built to be admired briefly, photographed, and exited. It was constructed as a permanent position, an elevated seat from which taste, authority, and cultural confidence radiated outward. Today, that confidence is absent. What remains is a structure performing continuity while quietly adapting to a world that no longer requires what it once represented. This is not a story of destruction. Olana was not burned, abandoned, or erased. It was transformed, carefully, legally, and with good intentions. The rupture is subtle. The change is administrative rather than violent. Yet the result is profound. A mansion designed as a private cultural engine now operates as a managed artifact, sustained by preservation rather than purpose. The loss is not measured in bricks or furniture, but in function. A place once defined by ownership, routine, and authority now exists as interpretation. The house no longer decides. It explains. It no longer commands a landscape. It contextualizes one. Olana matters because it reveals how elite power ends, not in collapse, but in conversion. When stewardship is replaced by maintenance, and living systems are stabilized into display, something vital is neutralized. The building remains. The worldview that created it does not. That quiet exchange is the subject of this story. In its current condition, Olana State Historic Site presents itself as resolved. The walls are maintained, the roofs are secured, the interiors are stabilized against decay. Nothing here suggests emergency or neglect. The site functions smoothly within a contemporary framework of preservation, access, and regulation. From the outside, it appears complete. Yet this completeness is deceptive. Olana now exists within a different logic than the one that produced it. The mansion no longer operates as a private system governed by ownership, authority, and daily necessity. It has been absorbed into an administrative structure designed to arrest change rather than direct it. What appears as continuity is, in fact, containment. The house is open, but only in defined ways. Movement follows approved paths. Rooms are encountered in sequence, not in use. Objects are present but no longer participate in routine. They do not circulate through daily life. They remain fixed, explained, and supervised. The building no longer absorbs the rhythms of living occupants. Instead, it absorbs visitors briefly, intermittently, without consequence. This condition is not accidental. Olana has been deliberately reclassified from a private cultural engine into a public historical asset. That transition required the introduction of rules, documentation, and oversight. Preservation replaced discretion. Interpretation replaced command. Every element now exists within a managed framework that prioritizes stability over authority. The transformation altered the relationship between the house and time. When Olana functioned as a private estate, time was generative. Decisions accumulated. Alterations responded to internal needs and external pressures. The structure evolved because it had to. In the present structure, time is neutralized. Change is minimized. Interventions are measured, reversible, and justified through policy. The goal is not evolution, but endurance. This endurance depends on external systems. Funding arrives through budgets rather than production. Labor is professionalized and scheduled, not embedded. Knowledge is formalized into archives, labels, and tours. The mansion no longer sustains itself through the authority of ownership. It survives through institutional support. That support comes with boundaries. Olana no longer governs its land in the way it once did. The surrounding landscape is preserved as a view rather than worked as territory. Paths are maintained for circulation, not necessity. The estate's relationship to its environment has shifted from command to presentation. The land is framed, not directed. What remains intact is form. The architecture still asserts presence. The siding still dominates its horizon. The interiors still convey ambition. But these signals now operate without the systems that once gave them force. Authority has been separated from appearance. This separation defines the present condition. Olana is neither ruined nor abandoned. It is functional, but no longer productive in the way it once was. It generates knowledge, not power. It hosts visitors, not dependents. Its routines are designed to preserve memory rather than sustain hierarchy. The rupture, then, is not physical. It is systemic. The mansion persists, but the structure of life that animated it has been replaced by an entirely different mechanism, one that values access, documentation, and restraints over command and continuity. This is the condition from which the story must proceed. Not decline, not collapse, but conversion. A living system rendered stable. A place that remains visible precisely because it no longer exercises authority. The modern operation of Olana depends on predictability. Its daily functions are calibrated to minimize risk, variation, and ambiguity. Climate controls regulate interior air. Conservation protocols determine light exposure. Visitor capacity is measured and limited. Every procedure exists to prevent deviation from an approved state. The house is no longer permitted to surprise itself. This regulatory environment has consequences beyond maintenance. It alters how the building is understood. Olana is no longer experienced as a site of decision-making, where authority shaped space in real time. It is encountered as a sequence of explanations. Each room carries a narrative assigned to it. Each object is fixed within a defined interpretive role. Meaning is no longer produced internally. It is delivered externally. The staff who sustain the site operate within this framework. Their work is essential, skilled, and constrained. They do not exercise discretion over the estate's direction. They implement policy. The mansion's survival depends not on personal stake, but on professional distance. Care has replaced attachment as the organizing principle. This shift affects how power is perceived within the structure. In its current state, Olana does not project authority outward. It does not command labor, land, or resources beyond its boundaries. Instead, it relies on networks of approval heritage boards, funding bodies, regulatory agencies. Its existence is justified through compliance rather than dominance. The house has become legible. Its risks have been reduced. Its unpredictability has been managed out of it. This legibility is what allows it to endure. But it also marks a fundamental change in function. Olana now serves as evidence rather than instrument. It demonstrates what once existed without reenacting it. The visitors who pass through encounter a stabilized version of the past. They move through spaces that appear complete, resolved, and finished. The disorder, improvisation, and authority that once animated the house are absent. What remains is coherence without tension. This coherence creates a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of systems operating correctly. Nothing here is unresolved. Nothing demands immediate action. The house no longer produces urgency. It absorbs attention without requiring response. In this way, Olana exemplifies a broader institutional condition. Elite structures that outlive their governing logic often do so by becoming manageable. They exchange autonomy for protection. They survive by surrendering the very qualities that once made them powerful. The present structure does not ask to be challenged. It asks to be maintained. Its value lies in its continued visibility, not in its capacity to act. The mansion remains because it has been rendered safe, socially, economically, and ideologically. This safety is not neutral. It represents a decision about what aspects of the past are permitted to persist. Authority, hierarchy, and command are removed from daily function and relocated into narrative. They are acknowledged, explained, and contained. Olana's current stability is therefore not an endpoint, but a condition produced by careful limitation. The building stands intact precisely because it no longer participates in the forces that once shaped it. Its endurance depends on restraint. This is the present structure, a mansion preserved in form, regulated in function, and emptied of the pressures that once justified its scale. A system that continues to exist because it no longer governs anything beyond itself. Before it became preserved, regulated, and explained, Olana State Historic Site functioned as a position within American cultural life. Its importance did not derive from comfort, size, or scenery alone. It mattered because it occupied a deliberate place in a hierarchy of influence that extended far beyond its walls. Olana was never intended to be an inward-looking residence. From its earliest conception, it was oriented outward toward landscapes, institutions, audiences, and judgments. The house was designed to be seen, discussed, and understood as evidence of cultivated authority. It did not simply shelter its owner, it broadcast a worldview. In the late 19th century, cultural power in the United States was still consolidating. Institutions were young, hierarchies fluid, and legitimacy contested. In that environment, houses like Olana operated as stabilizing mechanisms. They anchored taste, they signaled seriousness. They asserted that culture, like capital, could be accumulated, organized, and displayed with discipline. Olana's cultural gravity lay in its synthesis. It unified art, landscape, architecture, and patronage into a single, coherent system. This coherence distinguished it from ordinary wealth. The house was not a passive container for possessions. It was an active framework through which ideas about refinement, authority, and national identity were organized. Visitors did not come merely to observe. They came to orient themselves. Olana offered a model of how culture could be arranged, how art should relate to land, how taste should shape environment, how private ownership could generate public influence without formal institutional status. It functioned as an informal academy, a reference point against which other ambitions were measured. The mansion's siting amplified this role. Elevated, expansive, and carefully framed, it occupied a commanding relationship with its surroundings. This was not accidental. Physical dominance reinforced cultural dominance. The house's visibility across the landscape mirrored its intended visibility within elite networks. To encounter Olana was to encounter a claim about order. That claim extended into daily life. The routines of the house, its hosting, its curation, its rhythms, were structured to sustain presence. Olana did not withdraw from cultural circulation. It participated in it continuously. Decisions made within its walls shaped conversations elsewhere. The house functioned as a node, not an endpoint. Importantly, this gravity was not dependent on mass recognition. Olana did not require popular approval. Its influence operated through selectivity. Access was controlled. Attention was concentrated. Cultural authority flowed not from numbers, but from positioning. To be associated with Olana was to be situated within a particular register of seriousness. The mansion's role, therefore, cannot be reduced to personal taste or aesthetic preference. It was an instrument within a larger system of cultural formation. It helped define what counted as cultivated, legitimate, and enduring at a moment when those definitions were still unstable. This gravity was subtle but persistent. It did not announce itself loudly. It operated through consistency, scale, and confidence. Olana mattered because it made culture appear settled, anchored to land, protected by wealth, and expressed through form. That sense of settlement gave the house its original weight. It was not merely admired. It was deferred to. It occupied a position that shaped perception without requiring formal authority or institutional mandate. The influence Olana exerted did not rely on spectacle. Its authority emerged through repetition and consistency. Over time, its presence established expectations about seriousness, permanence, and cultural intent. It suggested that taste was not an accessory to wealth, but a discipline that required structure, patience, and land. Within elite American life, such places functioned as informal regulators. They did not legislate standards, but they normalized them. Olana's existence implied that culture could be organized privately yet operate publicly. This arrangement mattered in a society still negotiating the boundaries between democratic ideals and inherited influence. The house offered a solution that appeared stable rather than ostentatious. Its cultural gravity also derived from insulation. Olana was distant enough from urban centers to suggest independence, yet close enough to remain engaged. This balance allowed it to operate above immediate commercial pressure while remaining relevant. The house was not reactive, it set its own tempo. That autonomy reinforced its authority. The estate's internal coherence further strengthened its position. Art, architecture, and landscape were not assembled casually. They were aligned. Each reinforced the other, producing a unified environment that conveyed intention rather than accumulation. This unity distinguished Olana from collections that merely displayed wealth. It presented a system, not a catalog. That system extended into social exchange. Gatherings at Olana were not incidental. They were structured encounters within a controlled environment. Conversation, observation, and judgment unfolded within a space already organized to privilege certain values. The house shaped interaction by shaping context. Its cultural role was enacted repeatedly, not declared. Importantly, Olana's gravity was durable because it appeared natural. The house did not advertise its influence. It embedded it in form. The authority it projected seemed to arise organically from landscape and design, rather than from assertion. This naturalization made its position difficult to contest. It felt inevitable. In this way, Olana participated in the construction of an American elite culture that sought legitimacy through rootedness. Land mattered, permanence mattered. The House signaled that cultural authority could be grown, not improvised. It suggested continuity in a nation often defined by movement. This continuity had implications beyond art or taste. It reinforced broader assumptions about who could define standards and where those standards should originate. Olana quietly affirmed that cultural leadership belonged to those who could afford distance, coherence, and time. The mansion's gravity was therefore cumulative. It did not depend on any single moment or event. It accrued through sustained presence. Each year the house remained coherent, its position strengthened. Each interaction conducted within its framework reinforced its role as reference rather than exception. What made Olana powerful was not that it claimed to represent the nation, but that it behaved as though it already did. Its confidence did not require validation. It assumed relevance and, through that assumption, produced it. This is the cultural position Olana once occupied. Not a home, but a stabilizing force. Not a refuge, but a point of orientation. Its gravity shaped how culture was understood, where authority resided, and how permanence could be constructed in an otherwise fluid society. The conception of Olana State Historic Site did not begin with a desire for shelter. It began with a position to be occupied. The house was envisioned as a structure capable of fixing ideas in place about culture, authority, and permanence, at a moment when such ideas remained unsettled in the American context. Olana was conceived deliberately, not impulsively. Its creation followed a logic shaped by observation of older systems, particularly European models where land, art, and power reinforced one another across generations. In contrast, the United States lacked entrenched cultural hierarchies. Institutions were young. Traditions were still forming. Olana emerged as an answer to that absence. The intent was not to replicate aristocracy, but to translate it. Olana's design sought to demonstrate that cultural authority could be constructed consciously, through alignment rather than inheritance. Architecture, landscape, and collection were arranged to signal that taste could be cultivated into legitimacy. The house was meant to stand as proof that refinement could be established, not merely claimed. This intent shaped every foundational decision. The choice of site was ideological. Elevation mattered, visibility mattered, distance from urban disorder mattered. Olana was positioned to overlook its surroundings, not to integrate with them. This vantage expressed a belief that authority required separation, physical and conceptual, from immediacy. The design rejected prevailing domestic norms. It did not prioritize comfort or efficiency. Instead, it prioritized articulation. Rooms were conceived as statements. Circulation was intentional. The house was structured to be read, not simply inhabited. Movement through it reinforced hierarchy and perspective rather than convenience. Materials and forms were selected for what they implied, not merely for their utility. Eclecticism was not accidental. It signaled command over reference. The house drew from multiple traditions to suggest fluency rather than allegiance. This synthesis communicated confidence, the belief that cultural authority could absorb influences without being defined by them. Importantly, Olana was designed to endure scrutiny. It assumed an audience capable of judgment. The house did not retreat from evaluation, it invited it. This openness was strategic. Cultural authority, as envisioned here, depended on being seen and assessed within elite circles. Visibility was not a risk, but a requirement. The intent extended beyond the building itself. Olana was conceived as a system that would shape behavior. Its spaces directed how art was encountered, how landscape was framed, how conversation unfolded. The house was meant to condition perception. In this sense, design functioned as ideology rendered physical. This ideology rested on several assumptions. That culture could be stabilized through ownership. That permanence could be achieved through coherence. That authority did not require formal power if it could command respect. Olana embodied these beliefs not through declaration, but through structure. The mansion was not designed to evolve organically. It was planned to arrive coherent. Change would occur within parameters set at conception. This preemptive control distinguished Olana from houses that accumulated meaning over time. Its meaning was embedded from the outset. What matters here is not the personality behind the vision, but the clarity of purpose. Olana was built to assert that cultural order was possible in America, and that it could be authored deliberately. The house was intended to stand as evidence of that conviction. Because the intent was ideological, the design process resisted compromise. Olana was not shaped by convenience, resale value, or prevailing fashion. It was shaped by a conviction that architecture could function as argument. Each structural choice reinforced a belief about how authority should appear, measured, layered, and resistant to immediacy. The house was conceived to slow perception. Approaches were elongated. Sightlines were framed deliberately. The building did not reveal itself all at once. This pacing was intentional. Cultural authority, as understood here, required patience. It was not meant to impress instantly, but to reward sustained attention. The house trained its observers to read carefully. Interior organization followed the same logic. Spaces were differentiated rather than neutral. Rooms carried distinct tonalities and purposes, encouraging comparison rather than flow. This differentiation communicated hierarchy without signage. Movement through the house mirrored a progression of ideas rather than a domestic routine. The structure instructed without explanation. The surrounding land was treated as extension rather than backdrop. Landscape was not left to chance. It was shaped, framed, and disciplined to reinforce the house's position. Nature was not opposed, but curated. This relationship expressed a belief that culture did not reject the natural world, it organized it. Control was exercised subtly, through selection and alignment. The intent also accounted for durability. Olana was designed to outlast shifts in taste precisely because it did not adhere to a single stylistic doctrine. Its eclecticism functioned as insulation. By refusing strict allegiance, the house avoided obsolescence. It presented itself as synthesis rather than statement, reducing vulnerability to change. This approach reflected a deeper assumption about cultural survival. Authority, to endure, must appear inevitable rather than argumentative. Olana did not seek to persuade overtly. It sought to normalize its presence. The design implied that such a structure belonged naturally in its setting, as though it had always been meant to stand there. Crucially, the house was conceived with an awareness of future scrutiny. It anticipated interpretation. It assumed that later generations would look back and ask what it represented. The design therefore encoded meaning densely, embedding intent into form so that it could be read even after original context faded. This foresight distinguished Olana from purely expressive projects. It was not built to capture a moment. It was built to anchor one. The house treated time as an element to be managed, not endured. Its conception accounted for continuity as a design problem. The intent also placed limits on change. While adaptation was expected, deviation was not. The house established boundaries within which alteration could occur without undermining coherence. This restraint was ideological. It asserted that culture required discipline to remain legible across time. What emerges from this conception is a clear alignment between belief and structure. Olana was not an experiment. It was a proposition stated with confidence. Its design assumed that cultural authority could be authored, stabilized, and made visible through careful orchestration. The result was a building that did not merely house ideas but fixed them in place. Design became belief made permanent. The mansion stood as an argument rendered in stone, wood, and land. An assertion that culture, when properly arranged, could claim endurance in a society still uncertain of its own hierarchies. This intent shaped everything that followed. Long before the house acquired history, it possessed purpose. For all its symbolic weight, Olana State Historic Site depended on a disciplined operating system. Its authority did not reside solely in architecture or landscape, but in the daily execution of routines that translated intent into lived order. The house functioned because an invisible machinery sustained it, quietly and continuously. This machinery was labor. Not abstract effort, but structured, repetitive work organized to preserve hierarchy and coherence. Every day at Olana unfolded according to expectations that were rarely articulated but always enforced. The smoothness of elite life depended on this regularity. Disorder was absorbed before it surfaced. Labor at Olana was differentiated and positional. Tasks were assigned not only by necessity, but by proximity to authority. Some roles remained visible, reinforcing formality and decorum. Others operated out of sight, ensuring that the appearance of effortlessness remained intact. The system relied on separation between decision and execution, command and service. Money moved through the house with similar discipline. Expenditure was not impulsive. It followed priorities that reflected the estate's ideological purpose. Resources were allocated to maintain coherence rather than comfort alone. Art, land management, and structural upkeep received attention because they sustained the house's cultural function. Consumption served stability. Financial control reinforced autonomy. Olana's operating system assumed independence from immediate market pressures. The estate functioned as a semi-closed economy, where production elsewhere enabled cultural authority here. This insulation allowed routines to persist without constant negotiation. Time could be spent refining rather than reacting. Daily life followed a rhythm that balanced predictability with discretion. Meals, hosting, and work occurred within established patterns, but without rigid schedules exposed to scrutiny. Flexibility existed, but it was contained within understood limits. This balance maintained control while preserving the appearance of ease. The house itself enforced these routines. Circulation paths separated labor from leisure. Storage, preparation, and maintenance were spatially removed from presentation. Architecture ensured that work remained necessary but unobtrusive. The building did not merely accommodate the operating system, it encoded it. Control was exercised through consistency rather than supervision. Expectations were internalized. The system functioned because deviation was rare, not because punishment was visible. Authority operated through design, repetition, and shared understanding. The estate did not need to assert control daily, it had already done so structurally. Importantly, this operating system extended beyond the house. Land management, views, and boundaries were maintained to support the estate's position. Paths were cleared, vistas preserved. The surrounding environment was incorporated into routine, reinforcing dominance through maintenance. Control reached outward, quietly. What this system produced was reliability. Olana could host, curate, and project authority because its internal operations were stable. The house did not improvise, it executed. This reliability distinguished elite life from mere wealth. It demonstrated capacity for sustained order. The operating system also created distance. Those who benefited most from the estate's coherence were least involved in its mechanics. This separation was intentional. Authority required insulation from process. The system protected decision-makers from friction, allowing cultural confidence to remain intact. In this way, Olana functioned as a lived structure rather than a static symbol. Its daily operations translated ideology into practice. Power was not declared, it was maintained through routine. The house remained authoritative because its machinery worked without interruption. This machinery is largely invisible now, but during its active life, it was the condition that made everything else possible. The stability of this system depended on continuity rather than innovation. Change, when it occurred, was incremental and absorbed quietly. New tasks were folded into existing roles. Adjustments in expenditure were made without altering priorities. The operating system did not adapt by reinventing itself. It adapted by reinforcing its core assumptions. Authority within the estate flowed downward without interruption. Decisions were centralized, but their effects were distributed through layers of responsibility. Instructions did not require elaboration because the structure itself limited interpretation. The system worked because its participants understood their position within it. Clarity replaced negotiation. This clarity extended to time. Days were not measured by urgency, but by repetition. The absence of crisis was itself a product of the operating system. Problems were addressed before they became visible. Repairs occurred without announcement. Supplies were replenished without notice. The house maintained an appearance of permanence precisely because it was constantly managed against erosion. Control over knowledge was another element of the system. Information moved selectively. Those responsible for execution possessed practical understanding, but not strategic context. Those responsible for direction remained insulated from operational detail. This asymmetry preserved hierarchy. Knowledge, like space, was partitioned. The operating system also shaped social interaction. Guests encountered a version of the house that appeared complete and effortless. They were not exposed to its labor or logistics. Their experience was curated, not staged. The smoothness they observed reinforced assumptions about authority and refinement. The system functioned as proof. Importantly, This machinery did not require constant presence of its central figures to operate. Once established, routines persisted. Authority had been embedded into process. The house could function predictably even in absence, a key feature of elite systems designed for longevity. Dependence on individual oversight was minimized. This autonomy allowed the estate to absorb external pressures without visible disruption. Economic fluctuations, seasonal changes, and shifting social demands were filtered through established routines. The operating system acted as a buffer, preserving continuity while accommodating necessary adjustments. Stability was not passive, it was maintained. The costs of this system were real, but they were normalized. Labor was continuous, resources were consumed steadily. The house's coherence required ongoing investment. This investment was justified by the cultural authority it sustained. The operating system existed to preserve position, not efficiency. Over time, the machinery became self-reinforcing. The more consistently it operated, the more indispensable it appeared. The house's authority seemed natural because its routines made it so. What was in fact the product of constant work came to be perceived as inherent quality. This perception masked vulnerability. The system relied on conditions that were not permanent: reliable income, accepted hierarchy, unquestioned legitimacy. As long as these conditions held, the operating system functioned seamlessly. It was not designed to explain itself or defend its existence. It assumed continuation. The invisibility of the machinery was its strength and its limitation. While active, it allowed the house to operate without friction. Once disrupted, it left little trace. When the system ceased to function, what remained was form without process. Understanding this operating system is essential because it reveals how elite life was sustained daily, not symbolically. The authority Olana projected was not abstract. It was assembled each day through labor, money, and routine. Power persisted because it was practiced continuously, even when unseen. This lived structure transformed ideology into habit. It is here, in the mechanics of daily operation, that the mansion's authority was most fully realized and most quietly dependent on conditions that could not last indefinitely. There was a period when Olana State Historic Site no longer needed to assert itself. Its authority had settled into place. The systems that sustained it, design, routine, capital, and cultural confidence, were aligned and mutually reinforcing. Nothing appeared provisional. Nothing felt strained. The estate functioned as though its position were assured. At this high point, Olana did not expand. It refined. The house was no longer in the process of becoming. Its major decisions had already been made. What followed was calibration rather than construction. Adjustments were subtle, internal, and controlled. This restraint signaled maturity. Authority expressed itself through maintenance, not ambition. Wealth at this stage operated as lubricant rather than engine. Resources flowed steadily enough to remove friction from daily life without introducing excess volatility. Spending reinforced coherence instead of spectacle. The estate's financial posture communicated confidence precisely because it avoided urgency. Money served continuity, not display. Cultural life at Olana reached equilibrium. The house no longer needed to prove its seriousness. Its role within elite networks was understood. Invitations carried weight. Presence implied recognition. The estate had become a reference point, not a participant seeking validation. Its authority was relational, sustained through acknowledgement rather than assertion. This balance extended to the relationship between private life and public influence. Olana was not isolated, but it was insulated. Engagement with broader cultural currents occurred on its own terms. The house absorbed ideas selectively, integrating what reinforced its coherence and excluding what did not. This selectivity was essential. It preserved identity without stagnation. The estate's routines reflected this stability. Daily operations proceeded without visible tension. Labor, management, and hosting were synchronized. The operating system described earlier functioned at full efficiency, not because it was optimized, but because it was unchallenged. Authority did not need to correct itself, it simply continued. The surrounding landscape reinforced this condition. Views were maintained, boundaries were respected. The estate's relationship to land appeared settled and reciprocal. Control did not require constant assertion because it had already been normalized. The environment reflected order because it was continuously shaped by it. Importantly, this high point was marked by an absence of self-consciousness. Olana did not behave as though it were at its peak. That awareness belonged to later interpretation. At the time, the estate operated under the assumption of persistence. Its systems were designed to continue indefinitely, and nothing yet suggested otherwise. Confidence at this stage was structural. It resided in alignment rather than attitude. Wealth supported culture. Culture justified structure. Structure reinforced authority. Each element depended on the others, but none appeared dominant. This balance created resilience without rigidity. The house's authority during this period was quiet. It did not dominate discourse through volume or visibility. It shaped expectations through consistency. Olana represented a settled answer to questions about cultural legitimacy that were still being negotiated elsewhere. It offered stability in a broader environment marked by change. This was the condition that made the estate powerful. Not growth, not expansion, but equilibrium. Olana mattered because it appeared complete, internally coherent, externally respected, and confidently positioned within elite American life. What made this high point significant is not that it was dramatic, but that it was sustainable, so long as the conditions that supported it remained intact. At this stage, the estate's authority was reinforced by repetition rather than innovation. Each successful season confirmed the previous one. The absence of disruption became evidence of legitimacy. Olana did not need to adapt quickly because it was not being tested. Its systems were calibrated for continuation, and continuation was exactly what occurred. The balance between wealth and culture manifested most clearly in restraint. Decisions favored preservation of coherence over pursuit of novelty. Acquisitions were measured. Alterations were rare. The estate demonstrated that cultural confidence could be expressed through refusal, through the choice not to expand, not to modernize, not to respond unnecessarily. This refusal signaled control. Socially, the house occupied a position of assurance. Those who engaged with it understood its terms implicitly. There was no need for explanation or performance. The estate did not compete for attention, it assumed it. This assumption structured interactions long before guests arrived. The house's reputation preceded it, reducing the need for display. The internal culture mirrored this outward confidence. Roles were stable. Expectations were clear. The operating system functioned without friction because it was no longer adjusting to growth or contraction. Labor sustained routine rather than transformation. This stability allowed attention to shift from management to refinement. Small improvements mattered more than structural change. The estate's relationship to time during this period was particularly revealing. Time was not experienced as pressure. There was no urgency to capitalize, liquidate, or reposition. The future was assumed to resemble the present closely enough to require no major recalibration. This assumption shaped behavior at every level. Decisions prioritized continuity over contingency. Such confidence carried an implicit risk. Systems that appear complete often become less attentive to their own conditions of existence. Olana's coherence depended on factors that remained stable largely because they were not questioned. The estate did not need to justify itself economically or culturally. Its authority was accepted within its sphere. This acceptance extended to its symbolic role. Olana did not actively define itself against alternatives. It did not argue for its relevance. Its existence alone suggested that a certain model of elite life was viable and settled. The house functioned as quiet confirmation that hierarchy, taste, and permanence could align successfully. What was at stake during this high point was not merely comfort or prestige. It was the credibility of a system. Olana demonstrated that private cultural authority could operate independently of formal institutions while still shaping standards. It embodied a confidence that did not require endorsement from the state or the market. The estate's apparent self-sufficiency was central to its power. It did not appear dependent. Income streams, labor structures, and cultural networks aligned in a way that minimized visible vulnerability. This alignment allowed the house to project stability outward while relying on conditions that were, in fact, contingent. The high point therefore represents a moment of maximum coherence. Everything that had been designed to work together did so. The mansion's form, its routines, its financial posture, and its cultural role were synchronized. Nothing yet suggested strain. This synchronization is what makes the period significant. It defines the baseline against which later changes would be measured. The authority Olana exercised during this time was not abstract. It was enacted daily, quietly, and with confidence. The estate stood not as an aspiration, but as a settled fact. Understanding this moment clarifies what would later be compromised. Before pressure arrived, Olana functioned exactly as intended. Its systems were intact. Its position was secure. The loss that followed can only be understood in relation to this equilibrium, when the house did not merely survive, but governed its own coherence without effort. The first signs of pressure on Olana State Historic Site did not arrive as crisis. They emerged as shifts in alignment between the estate and the world that sustained it. Nothing within the house failed abruptly. Instead, conditions beyond its boundaries began to change in ways the operating system had not been designed to absorb indefinitely. Economic patterns altered first, quietly. Wealth that had once flowed predictably became less assured, not through collapse but through redistribution and diversification. Capital increasingly favored liquidity over permanence. The estate's model capital converted into land, structure, and long-term coherence no longer matched prevailing financial logic. Resources still existed, but their optimal use was being redefined elsewhere. Inheritance introduced another layer of pressure. Systems built on continuity assume transfer without disruption. Yet inheritance rarely preserves intent intact. It converts authority into responsibility, belief into obligation. What had once been a living ideology embedded in design became, over time, an asset requiring management. The estate's coherence depended on stewardship aligned with its original purpose, an alignment that inheritance does not guarantee. These pressures were structural rather than personal. They did not arise from disagreement or misjudgment, but from mismatch. Olana had been designed for a world in which cultural authority could be stabilized privately and sustained across time. That world was changing. Institutions were professionalizing. Public museums, universities, and cultural organizations were consolidating influence. Authority was migrating from private estates to formal systems. Cultural change compounded this shift. Taste was no longer anchored to place in the same way. Mobility increased. Urban centers intensified their pull. The notion that cultural leadership required rootedness in land weakened. Olana's distance, once an asset, became less central to cultural circulation. Influence no longer needed elevation to assert itself. None of this demanded immediate response. The estate could continue to operate as it had. Its routines still functioned. Its form still conveyed authority. But the conditions that made that authority legible were evolving. What had once been read as permanence began to resemble immobility. Stability risked being interpreted as resistance rather than confidence. The operating system, so effective during the high point, now faced inputs it had not been designed to process. Economic rationality favored flexibility. Cultural legitimacy favored institutions over individuals. Inheritance favored preservation over authorship. Each pressure was manageable in isolation. Together, they altered the environment in which the house existed. Importantly, these forces did not originate within the mansion. They approached it gradually, reframing its position without confronting it directly. Olana was not challenged, it was bypassed. Its authority remained intact internally, even as its external relevance subtly shifted. The estate's response was minimal, not out of denial but because its structure encouraged continuity. Systems optimized for stability are slow to register change. They interpret variation as temporary noise rather than signal. This conservatism preserved coherence in the short term, but it also delayed adaptation. What emerged during this period was inevitability without urgency. No single decision marked the turning point. No event forced immediate transformation. Instead, the balance that had sustained Olana began to tilt under pressures that did not require permission to act. These external forces did not seek to dismantle the estate. They simply redefined the conditions under which such a place could function as intended. Olana remained intact, but the world around it was reorganizing. The mansion's future would be shaped not by failure within its walls, but by changes that rendered its original operating assumptions increasingly difficult to sustain. As these pressures accumulated, they began to alter the estate's margins rather than its center. Olana continued to function, but the ease with which it had once absorbed cost, labor, and maintenance diminished. What had been routine became subject to calculation. Decisions that previously reinforced coherence now required justification. Economic logic increasingly intruded on cultural logic. The estate's scale demanded ongoing investment, yet the returns were no longer self-evident within contemporary frameworks of value. Land tied up capital. Buildings required specialized care. The operating system, once sustained by confidence, now depended on accounting. This shift did not undermine the house's form, but it changed how that form was understood. Inheritance intensified this recalibration. Responsibility replaced authorship. The estate could no longer assume that belief would be renewed with each generation. Instead, it required explanation, negotiation, and compromise. The mansion's purpose, once implicit, now had to be articulated. This articulation exposed fragility. Systems designed to operate silently are vulnerable when asked to justify themselves. Cultural authority, meanwhile, was consolidating elsewhere. Museums and public institutions increasingly defined standards of taste and historical significance. Their legitimacy derived from professionalization rather than ownership. Olana's private model appeared increasingly anachronistic. Its authority was intact, but its position within the cultural hierarchy was shifting. This shift altered the meaning of stewardship. Maintaining the estate no longer reinforced cultural leadership in the same way. Preservation began to substitute for authorship. The task became one of safeguarding rather than shaping. This distinction mattered. Safeguarding preserves form, shaping sustains relevance. The mansion's isolation, once protective, now limited its adaptability. Distance reduced immediacy. Engagement with emerging cultural currents required mediation rather than participation. Olana remained visible, but its influence diffused. It was no longer a node through which ideas circulated naturally. It became a site to be visited, rather than a position to be occupied. None of these changes demanded abrupt action. The estate could persist as it was, drawing on reserves of coherence and reputation. But the cost of persistence increased. Each year of stability required greater effort to maintain the same position. What had once been effortless now required intention. This imbalance introduced a subtle pressure toward conversion. When private authority becomes difficult to sustain, it seeks protection. When cultural legitimacy shifts toward institutions, private systems adapt by aligning with them. The conditions favored transition without rupture. Inevitability emerged not from decline, but from mismatch. Olana's design assumed a world in which private cultural authority could remain central. That assumption no longer held. The estate was not failing. It was out of alignment with the structures that now governed value, legitimacy, and continuity. The pressures reshaping its future were indifferent to its history. They operated according to broader reorganizations of economy and culture. Olana could not negotiate with them. It could only respond indirectly, through adjustment or reclassification. This period did not announce an ending. It prepared one. The estate remained intact, but its operating assumptions were under strain. External forces had begun to redefine what survival would mean, not as continued authority, but as continued existence. The inevitability lay in this distinction. To endure, Olana would have to change its relationship to power. The pressures did not demand collapse, they demanded transformation. The transition at Olana State Historic Site did not announce itself as surrender. It arrived as management. The language changed first. Decisions were framed as responsibilities. Actions were justified as protection. What had once been stewardship grounded in belief was reframed as custody grounded in obligation. This shift altered the estate's internal logic. Stewardship had implied authorship, a right to decide what the house should become, how it should evolve, and what risks were worth taking to preserve coherence. Custodianship removed that authority. It narrowed the scope of action to what could be defended, documented, and approved. The house ceased to be directed. It began to be administered. Ownership, in this new condition, no longer expressed ideology. It expressed liability. The estate was no longer a platform for cultural position-taking. It was a complex asset requiring oversight. Decisions prioritized risk reduction over meaning. The goal was not to extend authority, but to prevent loss. Extraction replaced commitment in subtle ways. Resources once devoted to sustaining a living system were redirected toward stabilization. Maintenance took precedence over direction. Value was drawn from the house through access, recognition, and symbolic capital, rather than through its capacity to shape culture actively. The estate began to yield proof of importance rather than exercise it. This extraction was not exploitative in the conventional sense. It was procedural. The house was converted into a source of legitimacy for external systems, heritage frameworks, preservation mandates, public narratives. Olana's authority was no longer exercised internally, it was harvested externally as historical significance. The operating system changed accordingly. Labor shifted from sustaining routine to enforcing compliance. Expertise replaced familiarity. The knowledge required to care for the house became specialized, codified, and transferable. Attachment was replaced by protocol. The mansion was no longer lived within as a system. It was serviced as an object. Control, once embedded in design and habit, migrated into policy. Decisions were no longer intuitive extensions of belief. They were outcomes of review. This introduced distance between the house and those responsible for it. Authority resided not in position, but in process. As this transition advanced, the estate's relationship to time transformed. Stewardship had assumed continuity through belief. Custody assumed continuity through preservation. The future was no longer something to be authored. It was something to be safeguarded against deterioration. This orientation limited possibility. It fixed the house in a narrow corridor of acceptable change. The hollowing occurred precisely here. Olana retained its form, its recognition, and its protection. What it lost was discretion. The ability to decide what the house meant in the present was replaced by the obligation to preserve what it had meant in the past. Meaning became retrospective. This condition did not diminish the house's visibility. It increased it. Olana became legible within systems that valued classification, access, and interpretation. But legibility came at the cost of agency. The mansion no longer set terms. It complied with them. What emerged was a managed property that survived by surrendering its capacity to act as an institution. The estate continued, but its governing logic had changed fundamentally. Authority was no longer produced within its walls. It was acknowledged elsewhere and reflected back. This marks the true transition. Not loss of structure, but loss of command. Not disappearance, but conversion. Olana remained present by becoming manageable. Once custodianship was established, the estate's function narrowed. Decisions were evaluated primarily for their defensibility, rather than their significance. The question shifted from what the house should express to what could be justified. This recalibration constrained imagination. The estate no longer generated direction, it received instruction. The extraction of value intensified through formalization. Olana's meaning was translated into categories: historical importance, artistic significance, scenic value. These classifications made the house portable within institutional frameworks. It could be cited, funded, and protected because it fit recognized criteria. In doing so, its authority was abstracted from lived practice into documentation. This abstraction altered the relationship between the house and those who cared for it. Knowledge became modular. Expertise could be applied without attachment. The estate did not require belief to function, only competence. While this ensured continuity, it severed the reciprocal bond that had once sustained coherence. The house no longer shaped its stewards, they managed it. The surrounding landscape underwent a parallel transformation. Land once governed as territory became landscape to be conserved. Control was exercised through restriction rather than use. Activity was limited to what could be preserved without alteration. The estate's relationship to its environment shifted from command to curation. The extraction process also stabilized narrative. Olana's story became fixed. Interpretation emphasized origins and achievements rather than ongoing function. The house was framed as completed rather than active. This framing made preservation easier but foreclosed evolution. A finished story does not require continuation. As authority receded, responsibility expanded. The estate became accountable to external standards and expectations. Decisions required consensus. Risk became unacceptable. The mansion's future was protected by limiting its present. This protection was effective, but it was also constraining. The hollowing of the institution was quiet because it appeared responsible. No damage was done. No neglect occurred. On the contrary, care intensified. Yet this care was oriented toward form rather than force. The estate survived by surrendering the qualities that once made it an active cultural position. What remained was presence without agency. Olana continued to signify importance, but it no longer generated it. Its authority was derivative, drawn from recognition rather than exercised through action. The house became a source of reference rather than a site of decision. This condition was stable, but it was not equivalent. The transition from stewardship to custodianship preserved the estate physically while extracting its institutional capacity. Olana endured, but as something fundamentally altered. The mansion now existed within a system that valued containment over command. Its survival depended on compliance, its relevance on interpretation. The operating logic that had once sustained elite life had been replaced by one designed to arrest change. This was the true hollowing. Not collapse, not abandonment, but a controlled transformation that allowed the house to persist by relinquishing authority. Olana remained visible precisely because it no longer governed itself. In its present condition, Olana State Historic Site survives through stabilization. The estate remains operational, but only within a narrow band of sanctioned function. Systems persist, yet they no longer converge toward authority. What endures is form, access, and care. What has vanished is command. Operational continuity is now technical. Climate systems regulate interiors. Conservation schedules determine intervention. Staff roles are defined by maintenance, interpretation, and compliance. These functions are precise and effective. They keep the structure intact, but they do not produce direction. The estate operates without issuing decisions of consequence. What remains active is preservation. Preservation, by design, suspends time. It halts processes that once allowed the house to act as a living system. Wear is arrested. Change is minimized. The building is held in a controlled present that resists both decay and transformation. This condition ensures survival, but it precludes evolution. The routines that once translated belief into daily practice are no longer operative. Hosting has become programming. Curation has become interpretation. Labor has become service. Each function continues in altered form, oriented toward explanation rather than enactment. The house no longer organizes life. It receives it. Authority, once embedded in spatial hierarchy and routine, has been externalized. Decisions affecting the estate originate outside its walls, filtered through administrative frameworks and professional standards. The house does not negotiate. It complies. Its stability depends on alignment with criteria it did not create. The landscape reflects this shift. Views are preserved, but not governed. Paths are maintained, but not worked. The land's role is aesthetic rather than functional. Control is exercised through restriction, what may not be altered, rather than through use. Territory has become scenery. What has vanished is the estate's capacity to absorb pressure and respond with initiative. Olana no longer adapts, it is adapted for. Its systems are optimized for endurance, not relevance. The mansion does not test its limits, it remains within them. This condition produces a particular clarity. The house is legible in ways it never was before. Its story is stabilized. Its risks are known. Its future is planned as continuation rather than possibility. The estate exists as a resolved object within a managed environment. Survival, in this context, is not evidence of strength, it is evidence of containment. The mansion endures because it has been relieved of authority. It no longer commands labor, land, or cultural direction. It persists as a site of reference, not as an institution. What remains operational, then, is a framework of care. What has vanished entirely is the capacity to decide what the house should become in the present. Preservation has succeeded in stabilizing Olana, but stabilization is not continuation. The estate survives, but it no longer governs its own coherence. That distinction defines its current state. The consequences of this condition unfold quietly. Without command, the estate cannot generate tension. It no longer encounters decisions that carry risk. Conflict has been removed in advance through policy and procedure. The house exists within a consensus that protects it from error by limiting action. This consensus ensures safety, but it also ensures stasis. What once required judgment now requires adherence. Where discretion once shaped outcomes, guidelines now delimit them. The mansion's future is imagined narrowly, as an extension of the present. Continuity is defined as repetition rather than renewal. The estate is protected from change by being denied the capacity to initiate it. This denial reshapes the meaning of endurance. Olana's continued presence does not indicate resilience in the institutional sense. It indicates compatibility with preservation frameworks. The house survives because it conforms to expectations designed to prevent transformation. Survival becomes conditional upon restraint. The loss of authority is most evident in the absence of consequence. Actions taken within the estate do not reverberate outward. They do not alter cultural direction or redistribute power. The house is encountered, not deferred to. It informs, but it does not orient. Its influence is informational rather than positional. This shift alters how time is experienced within the estate. The present is curated as a stable exhibit. The past is interpreted as complete. The future is anticipated only as maintenance. Time no longer accumulates meaning through use. It is managed to avoid disruption. The estate's coherence, once dynamic, is now fixed. Relationships between spaces, objects, and narratives are preserved as they are. This preservation removes the possibility of misalignment, but it also removes the possibility of rearticulation. The house cannot answer new questions because it has been configured to repeat old ones. What survives most fully is appearance. The mansion continues to project authority visually. Its scale, siting, and articulation remain persuasive. But these signals now operate without backing. They are vestigial forms that persist after function has migrated elsewhere. Authority is suggested, not exercised. This condition produces a subtle dissonance. Visitors encounter a structure built to command, now asking only to be observed. The house remains imposing, yet inert. Its presence is undeniable, but its capacity to act has been withdrawn. Preservation has achieved its goal. Olana is secure. Its materials are stable. Its story is accessible. But the cost of this security is the loss of institutional life. The estate has been transformed into an object that endures without authority. This endurance is not failure. It is a choice made by systems that value protection over agency. Olana survives because it no longer participates in the forces that once defined it. Its command has been replaced by care. The distinction matters. To survive without command is to exist without consequence. The mansion remains, but it no longer governs its own meaning. It persists as a stabilized artifact, present, legible, and fundamentally hollowed of the power that once justified its form. What remains of Olana State Historic Site is neither victory nor loss. It is a condition that modern systems increasingly produce: endurance without agency, visibility without authority, care without command. The mansion does not stand as a warning or a success story. It stands as evidence. Olana now represents a resolved compromise between past power and present values. It has been retained because it is legible, admirable, and containable. Its survival signals not continuity of purpose, but compatibility with contemporary frameworks that prioritize access, preservation, and explanation over authorship. The house remains because it fits what the present is willing to sustain. This condition reframes the meaning of legacy. Legacy here is not transmission of intent, but retention of form. What has been carried forward is appearance, not authority. The mansion's endurance suggests that preservation can stabilize material culture while quietly severing it from the forces that once animated it. The result is continuity of surface paired with absence of consequence. Olana's current role is descriptive. It tells a story about what once functioned, but it does not participate in shaping what follows. Its authority has been translated into narrative. Its power has become subject matter. The house exists as reference rather than actor. This transformation reflects a broader institutional logic. When systems outlive their governing beliefs, they are often absorbed into structures designed to neutralize risk. Preservation replaces purpose. Care replaces command. These substitutions allow survival, but they also redefine what survival means. To endure is no longer to act, but to remain intact. The mansion's quiet presence raises a question without demanding an answer. It asks whether purpose can ever be replaced by protection without altering the nature of what is preserved. Olana suggests that something essential is lost when systems designed to exercise authority are converted into objects of care. Yet the question is not accusatory. The conversion was deliberate, measured, and widely justified. The house is safer now than it ever was. Its future is planned. Its decay is monitored. Its story is accessible. These are achievements, but they operate within a framework that assumes authority itself is no longer necessary or desirable. Olana stands as a completed argument about how the present relates to the past. It shows what modern culture chooses to keep and how it chooses to keep it. The mansion remains, not as a governing institution, but as a stabilized artifact that confirms the values of the systems that now sustain it. The question it poses is therefore quiet but persistent. Can preservation substitute for purpose without fundamentally changing what is preserved? The condition Olana embodies does not resolve into conclusion. It remains open, sustained by systems that are efficient precisely because they avoid uncertainty. The mansion's continued existence affirms that modern preservation is capable of extraordinary care. What it does not affirm is continuity of intent. Purpose in this context is not nostalgia for authority. It is the capacity to decide, to risk misalignment, to allow a system to generate new meaning rather than only conserve old form. Olana no longer possesses that capacity. Its future is safeguarded against deviation. The house cannot surprise the present because it has been stabilized to reflect it. This stabilization alters the relationship between past and present. The past is presented as complete, interpretable, and finished. The present becomes custodian rather than inheritor. In this arrangement, history is protected from use. It is preserved from being asked to act. What Olana represents now is the end state of a particular trajectory. A private institution built to exercise cultural authority has been successfully converted into a public artifact designed to be maintained. The transformation is orderly, justified, and largely irreversible. The mansion's survival confirms the effectiveness of this process. Yet something remains unresolved. The house was designed to function as a living position within culture, not as an object awaiting explanation. Its form still implies command, even as its function has been withdrawn. This dissonance persists quietly, detectable only through sustained attention. The question Olana poses is not whether preservation is valuable, it is whether preservation can ever be equivalent. Whether a system designed to arrest change can substitute for one designed to direct it. Whether care can replace authority without altering the nature of what is cared for. The mansion does not answer. It simply remains, held in place by structures that ensure its endurance while limiting its agency. Its survival is complete, but its role is concluded. Olana now exists as a condition the present has chosen: stability over authorship, access over command, memory over consequence. It does not argue against this choice. It embodies it. The house stands, intact and legible, asking nothing further. Its quiet question endures, not as critique, but as fact.